days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became bright as light. Suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about this vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. During youth group a few weeks ago, we were watching a video that talked about how important it is that Jesus came to this world as a poor baby from Bethlehem, which the video jokingly and not so nicely referred to as a backwater of a backwater town in those days. And after the video, I asked the youth why they thought it mattered that Jesus came to us in this form, from a tiny little nowhere town, as a humble baby in a manger, when he didn't have to. And one of them, I won't name names, said, "Honestly, I think it would have been way cooler if Jesus had just come on a flying shiny unicorn." And I think about that a lot this week, because although we unfortunately never get to see Jesus riding in on a flying shiny unicorn, our gospel today is perhaps as close as we get to unicorn Jesus. Today, on Transfiguration Sunday, we read that Jesus is completely transfigured before Peter, James, and John, that his face shines like the sun and his clothes become bright as light, and that Moses and Elijah, long dead, appear next to him. And we hear that a bright cloud overshadows them, and a voice from heaven proclaims, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." This is a spectacular, awe-inspiring, divine moment that completely knocks us back with its power. But it's also kind of strange and mysterious. You see, when we talked about this idea of unicorn Jesus in youth group, most everyone agreed, including me, that yes, it would have been pretty awesome to see Jesus flying in on a shiny unicorn. But one of the youth pointed out that unicorn Jesus doesn't really work because he's not very relatable. And I think there's something so wise about that statement. After all, it's really easy to look at this text and go, okay, this is cool and all for Jesus, but what does it really mean for me? Why is Transfiguration Sunday so important? Well, to understand why, we need to remember what happened just before our gospel story today. Just a few days earlier, Jesus began to tell his disciples for the first time that he was going to suffer and die and be resurrected, which leads to that infamous interaction between him and Peter, where Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan." And then Jesus tells his disciples that anyone who follows him must deny themselves and take up their cross. That whoever would save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for his sake will save it. And that's not the message the disciples want to hear. They have left everything behind to follow Jesus. At this point in their ministry, they have been with Jesus as he taught parables and healed people and attracted huge crowds. They have seen him walk on water and feed the 5,000 and even raise a girl from the dead. It would have felt like the beginning of something triumphant, a sign that the Messiah was here to liberate them at last. So hearing that Jesus was going to die, that would have shaken the very foundation of their world. And so we read today that 6 days later, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain as they feel like everything is changing around them. And when Jesus is transfigured before them, when his face shines like the sun and Moses and Elijah appear, Peter says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." In other words, he wants to build a dwelling place to honor them, to mark this glorious moment, to make it possible for them to stay here together. Now, Peter has gotten a lot of crap for offering this over the years, with many scholars arguing that Peter was just doing whatever he could to keep Jesus on the mountain. But who could really blame him? If you had just been told that suffering and death were ahead, wouldn't you also want to stay on the mountain? If you had just been told that your entire world was about to change, wouldn't you want to hold on to that comfort and glory just a little bit longer? Reverend Eric Fissler, who produces this wonderful podcast called the Pulpit Fiction Podcast that I highly recommend, points out that in many ways, Peter's tents are like our churches today. We too build sacred spaces. We too mark holy moments. We too gather week after week to be in community together. And on one hand, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, having places where we can be together in community, where we can feel Christ dwelling with us most fully, is so important, especially when our world feels unstable. But the problem is not so much what Peter wanted to experience, but rather what Peter was hoping to avoid. He wants to stay on the mountain, not simply to experience the presence of God, but to avoid the suffering he knows comes at the bottom. He wants the glory without the descent, the shining, powerful unicorn Christ without the Christ born in a backwater town who is destined to suffer and die. And if we can be honest with ourselves, I think we sometimes want the same thing. When the world feels chaotic and injustice feels overwhelming, we come to church wanting comfort, wanting certainty, sometimes wanting something easy and unchanging to hold on to. I can admit I certainly feel like that sometimes. As Reverend Fissler puts it, too often we come to church, we participate in church, but we do not expect transformation. And it's right here on this mountain that we are called to ask ourselves this question. Do we come to church expecting to be transformed and sent, or are we hoping to stay comfortable? Are we gathering here in this sacred tent expecting God to change us, or are we gathering to preserve a version of our faith that feels safe? Because the voice that comes down from the cloud in our gospel today does not say, "Stay here where it is comfortable." Instead, the voice says, "Listen to him." In saying this, the voice confirms everything the disciples feared, That Jesus' radiance on the mountain does not erase the fact that he's destined to suffer and die on the cross. That God's voice claiming him from heaven does not erase the fact that the disciples are called to take up their cross and follow Jesus. And in response to this realization, the disciples fall to the ground and are utterly overcome with fear. And again, who can blame them? Transformation is terrifying. It's one thing to admire Jesus in all his glory atop the mountain, and another thing to follow him down that mountain. It's one thing to follow Jesus when he's healing crowds and walking on water, but another thing to follow him to the cross. And it's one thing for all of us to come to church every week, but it's another thing to walk out these doors and allow our entire lives to be transformed by Christ, with all that that implies. It's understandable to hear the call in this gospel and, like the disciples, feel utterly overcome with fear. But the wonderful news in our gospel today is that within this fear, Jesus speaks this remarkable word of grace to his disciples and to all of us. Jesus comes to his disciples and touches them. Jesus comes to their level and says, "Get up and do not be afraid." Back in youth group, after one of the youth said that Unicorn Jesus wouldn't be relatable enough, I asked them, why does it matter that Jesus is relatable? Let me tell you, we have some pretty smart youth. I'm saying this because they're not going to hear it. If they heard me say this, they would like it a little too much. But no, I'm kidding. One of them said, because it's important that we know that Jesus is just like us. Another said, because when we know that Jesus has been through what we've been through, we know that we're never alone. Again, said it way better than I ever could have. This is the promise that we get in our gospel today. When the disciples raise their eyes, they see Jesus, alone and no longer shining, waiting for them. When Jesus sees that the disciples are overwhelmed with fear, he comes down to their level and touches them. He shows them that he too is human, that he too understands the fear that they're feeling. He shows them that even though he has the option to choose glory and power and heavenly voices from clouds, he instead chooses them and us every single time. And then he says, "Get up and do not be afraid." The Greek word that Jesus uses for "get up" here is the same word that is later used over and over again to describe Jesus' resurrection. So Jesus is not simply saying, "Get up." He's promising the disciples that there is new life to be had amidst the fear they are feeling. That even though they feel like their world is ending and everything is changing around them, God is still at work even now, making something new. And of course, Jesus' words, "Do not be afraid," don't make the disciples' fear magically disappear. I don't think that's worked ever for any of us, right? But these words do invite the disciples to not let fear have the final say, to instead see the new life that God is creating, and amidst fear, take that next step anyway. After all, the disciples did not follow Jesus down off that mountain with full understanding or total faith. We see proof of that again and again in the Gospels. But they did come down from that mountain with the promise that they would be loved always, with the promise that Christ will never leave them. They came down the mountain with a voice to trust and a command to follow. And they came down the mountain transformed, with the ability to take the next step into their new life despite their fear. So perhaps this answers the question of why Transfiguration Sunday is important for us. Perhaps it's not about Jesus' transfiguration at all, but it's about the disciples and our transformation. Perhaps it's important to have one Sunday each year to remind us that even when we feel like the world is ending, even when we are full of fear, Jesus still reaches across the ages and invites us to get up, to be resurrected, to be transformed, and to take the next step off the mountain and out into the world, trusting that God is at work even now, making things new. So today, we are celebrating Transfiguration Sunday as we do every year, as this bridge between our seasons of Epiphany and Lent. Because from this moment forward, we will bury the alleluias later in church, and we know that Jesus is journeying toward the cross. And as we move into Lent and the weeks ahead, we at Wicker Park Lutheran Church are going to be accompanying Jesus through our sermon series to the theme, Seeking, Deeper Questions for Honest Faith. And maybe this Sunday gives us our first deeper question to think about in the week ahead. Transfiguration Sunday calls us to consider, what is our faith asking of us and of Wicker Park Lutheran Church? Or rather, through our transformation, where are we as a church being called? Transfiguration Sunday reminds us that we are being called out of this tent where it is comfortable and down the mountain where we know change and danger lie ahead. It reminds us that we are being called out of our church and into the world, into our relationships, into the streets, into our communities. And it reminds us that instead of the dazzling unicorn Jesus, we have something even better. The Jesus who touches us, who transforms us, and who sends us, even amidst fear, to take that next faithful step into God's unfolding kingdom. Amen.